I want to talk today about a skeptical trope or meme, which I think gets undeserved credit from a true probability theory fact. And I want to distinguish the skeptical meme from the true probability fact so that you're not confused by that. And I think it can also come up in other contexts, not just in the context of skepticism about the existence of God. In fact, it can come up in almost any context. And so you can apply it in other areas if you're interested in it. But I think those who are interested in the philosophy of religion and interested in apologetics and arguments for the existence of God will find this application useful. So the trope in question goes something a little bit like this. Both the Christian and the skeptic believe that the physical world exists. But the Christian also believes that the Christian God exists and made the physical world. Now, as this trope would go, it would say, well, by just withholding being agnostic, or possibly even being an atheist, saying that God does not exist, the skeptic says, I'm taking the simpler position. I'm taking the less contentful position. Christian and I both agree that the physical world exists, but I'm just not believing, in addition, that the Christian God exists and created it. So I'm being more cautious. And especially if the person is agnostic, that might sound attractive. That agnosticism is somehow the more reasonable, it's like always the default or the more cautious position. To understand what's wrong with this, I'm going to use an analogy of the kind that I like to make. So let's talk about the proposition, Tim McGrew exists. And now let's compare that to the proposition, Tim McGrew is married to Lydia. Now, here's the true probability theory fact. Tim McGrew exists is strictly logically weaker, as we philosophers put it, than Tim McGrew exists and is married to Lydia. I mean, Tim McGrew is married to Lydia entails that he exists, but that he exists does not entail that he's married to Lydia. So in that sense, the logically weaker statement is the one that has less content. Okay, and it's entailed by the logically stronger statement. Now, if we just stick to the same evidence in both cases, and we compare the probability of Tim McGrew exists and the probability of Tim McGrew exists and is married to Lydia, it's always going to be true that Tim McGrew exists and is married to Lydia is going to have a lower probability than Tim McGrew exists. So that might seem like it supports that idea that agnosticism is somehow more cautious, more reasonable, more justified. But let's see how that would look if you tried to do it with Tim McGrew exists and is married to Lydia. Now let's suppose that we imagine a person who has a lot of the evidence that many of you out there in viewerland have that Tim and I are in fact married to one another. Maybe you've met us. Maybe you've done some Googling and you've found references to us being married to one another. You know people who know us who affirm that we're married to one another, and you can spin this out. Okay, you've seen Tim refer to me as his wife and me refer to him as my husband and so forth. So let's suppose that this person has that evidence but says, you know what, I'm just being more cautious, because after all, the statement that Tim is married to Lydia is a stronger claim than the claim that he just exists. So I'm just going to believe that Tim exists, and I'm just going to be agnostic about whether he's married to Lydia, despite the evidence the person has. Well, is that person really being reasonable? No, it seems very intuitive that that person is being unreasonable because he has all this evidence that Tim and I are married to each other. So what's happened here? Well, that person has apparently confused the idea that Tim McGrew exists has a higher probability than Tim McGrew exists and is married to Lydia, with the idea that it's reasonable to be agnostic about the second of those. Though that doesn't follow. So, for example, Tim McGrew exists on his evidence could have a probability of 0.999, and Tim McGrew is married to Lydia could have a probability of 0.99. They're both highly, highly probable to the point that it's unreasonable for him to be agnostic about either of them. But yes, the one with more content does have a lower probability. That's just a comparative statement. That doesn't tell us anything about agnosticism. It certainly doesn't tell us anything about being skeptical. Oh, I don't think Tim is married to Lydia. Okay, it doesn't say anything bad about the probability of Tim exists and is married to Lydia. That could be really, really high. And the other one could just be really, really higher, as is in fact the case based on the evidence that many of you have. So now we go back and we see how that applies to the matter of the existence of the world and Christian theism. To say that Christian theism is the stronger statement is, in a sense, trivially true. Yes, Christian theism includes the idea that there is a physical world, but also that the Christian God exists and made the physical world. That doesn't tell you anything about its being reasonable to be agnostic. To say comparatively that the physical world exists is more probable than the physical world exists and is created by God doesn't tell you how probable either of them is. Part of what I think people are not realizing when they think that is that when I just say Tim exists and I just stop, I'm not saying anything about the evidence that he's married to Lydia, right? I'm not saying that it's strong. I'm not saying that it's weak. I'm not saying anything about any other proposition about him, that he likes chocolate ice cream, that he likes pizza, where he teaches, etc., right? I'm just saying he exists, and then I'm just not saying anything else. I'm not withholding judgment. I may have very strong opinions on all these other things, and I may have justified strong opinions. In the same way, to say God, I'm not going to use God exists, I'm going to use the physical world exists. To say the physical world exists, and then I just stop. Now, I'm not saying anything about where it came from. Somebody who says the physical world exists and just stops, he could be a Christian, an atheist, a Hindu, or whatever. That's the thing that is logically weak. But the minute I go beyond that and I say the physical world exists and we should be agnostic about whether it was created by the Christian God, that's not particularly a logically weak statement. That's a statement about the state of the evidence. Just like if I go on and I say Tim exists and we should be agnostic about whether he's married to Lydia, that's no longer a logically weak statement. And at that point, that could be a completely unreasonable statement. I am no longer being safe. The minute I go out there and I endorse agnosticism, much less go even farther, right? The physical world exists and God does not exist. Tim exists and he is not married to Lydia. Then that's definitely a very strong statement, okay? So I'm not being safe anymore at that point. I'm not anymore choosing something that is simple. And here's another way to see it too. If a person says that Tim exists, but he's agnostic about whether he's married to Lydia, but that person has all this evidence that he is married to me, what's that person going to do with that evidence? He's going to have to come up with some other explanation that he's at least going to treat as somewhat reasonable, even to be agnostic. Like there's some vast conspiracy to say that Tim is married to me, even though he isn't. Well, maybe, I don't know. Okay, so that's not simple anymore, right? Because now I'm spinning out this alternative theory to try to explain away the evidence that Tim's married to Lydia. That's another way to see that that is no longer a cautious position. That is no longer a simple position, and therefore it's not a safe position. And in the same way, if you have a lot of evidence that the Christian God exists, and you're then trying to explain that away, then that's not just merely stating that the physical world exists. That's going farther than that. That's trying to come up with some alternative explanation for this theistic evidence, and at least give that a reasonable probability, even in order to maintain agnosticism. Now, we need to distinguish this from a situation where you have no evidence whatsoever. If you have no evidence about a topic, then of course it's reasonable to say, I don't know. If somebody asked me, what color shirt is Vladimir Putin wearing today? I would say, I don't know. I have absolutely no idea what color shirt Vladimir Putin is wearing today. Their agnosticism is reasonable because I don't have evidence. But when we're working with a body of evidence, then whether agnosticism is reasonable or not depends on what that evidence is and what that evidence supports. And so agnosticism can be extremely unreasonable, and it can be extremely complex as well. And denying a proposition can be extremely complex. So neither agnosticism nor denial gets some kind of extra push like that's a default position. It depends on the evidential state, whether that is a reasonable position or not. This applies in other places. I mean, you could apply it anywhere. But consider, for example, the reliability of the Gospels. Suppose you heard someone say, now, let's just be cautious about saying that the Gospel of John is historical reportage. Let's just say we're just not sure about that. That's being cautious. That's not striding too boldly out there and taking a position contrary to other scholars and so forth. Of course, this person is using scholarly consensus. But notice that that's treating, again, it's treating agnosticism as if it's a cautious position. But agnosticism isn't necessarily a safe or a cautious position. That depends on the state of the evidence. So if we have a ton of evidence that John is very historically reliable, that he is history in a pretty straightforward sense, then it's not cautious anymore to say, well, I just don't know. I'm just going to withhold. I'm not going to take a position on that. Now you're not actually being cautious. You're actually taking the position that the evidence is not so strong as to make it unreasonable to withhold on that proposition. And if the evidence is strong enough, then it is unreasonable to withhold, in which case it's no longer the safe position. So this point has got a lot of different applications. Again, merely to say a proposition like Tim exists and to stop is not the same thing as to say Tim exists and we should be agnostic about something else. There you're actually committing yourself. You're committing yourself further. And in the same way, to say the world exists and we should be agnostic about whether God exists is actually committing yourself to something concerning the state of the evidence. Now, if you like this content, I hope you will like this video and subscribe to this channel so that you can get more and more of this content, because Lord willing, there will be more content of this same kind where we're applying probability, but we're applying it to topics that are of interest to people, like the existence of God. Come back next time to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.